the number of kilometers of roads, that would be one measure. But as you would get away from the capital, you know, the amount of tarmac on the road crumbles away until at some point the amount of tarmac that's left is really only about this wide. So you can really only keep your right tires on the tarmac and the rest is in the dirt. So that road is clearly not as good as one that's tarmaced all the way to the margins of the road. So clearly, again, here, quality of investment rises as well with good institutions. And then when we did this hybrid, again, where we combined the two, we found the same positive relation. So that's my story. What do we know? We know that public investment tends to boost growth and generate better macroeconomic outcomes. That's clear. Could even pay for itself in some cases. The more efficient you are delivering public investment, the more likely you are to get this good growth impact, right? So better efficiency generates better growth impact. And what we know finally is that good public finance management or public investment management institutions tend to boost this efficiency. So at the end of the day, you know, by transitivity, if you have good institutions, you're likely to get more growth, bang for your investment buck. That's the bottom line. There's no rocket science to this concept, but I think it's nice to see a kind of clear exposition of the result. I listed a couple of websites at the bottom for how many countries are seeking to strengthen their public finance and public investment management institutions. The World Bank, along with a number of other institutions, the ADB, the IMF, and others, do something called PIFA, Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment Framework. And then at the fund, we've also been doing something a little more narrow, targeted on fiscal transparency, which a number of countries, including a number of G20 countries, have undergone, which is sort of a stock taking of the quality of your institutions in the public sector area. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Just one question, Tom. I mean, you might want to tell us.
Let me think about it while we sit down, and I'll tell you over the questions. Okay?
Thanks a lot, Tom. That is very clear. We await with bated breath your answer to that question, since that's what you started with. No, that is very nice indeed. Thank you. So now we've sort of had kind of G20 and infrastructure and a kind of global comparative and analytical view of infrastructure or the public investment role in economic development and what needs to be done and what's done should be done better. So I think the next two speakers are going to move more to kind of the Indian space, or our problems and priorities in infrastructure, which, as we all know, those of us who've lived here for a long time, it's been there for several decades, from probably the inception of the country, as post-independence. So with that, Rajiv, can I invite you to, you once again have, like the other speakers, his very impressive biodata. He's, as you know, the executive chairman of IDFC, but from October 1, he's going to transform himself into a somewhat different label, running IDFC Bank, which will be somewhat different institution we expect, but we won't spend time on that. And he's also on innumerable committees to do with infrastructure, both public, private, quasi-public, PPP, everything you could name. So with that, Rajiv, over to you.
So thank you. May I?
Please.
Yeah, so I think that since we are making the transition to the Indian experience, it's better to remain seated. So maybe and again, we are in the transition, maybe what I do is I'll spend 5 minutes on the G20 perspective and then switch to India. And both the preceding the presentations are a very valuable complement to what I hope to share with you. So first on the G20 perspective, I have been associated with some of the work in the G20 because I was the Indian representative on the high-level committee that was appointed in Seoul. And now looking back on that experience and reflecting on the most, your concluding remark, I think it's fair to say that there's been too much emphasis or preoccupation with funding issues and financing gaps, and not nearly enough on institutional form. So that is really the broad message that I wanted to reiterate, even based on the Indian experience. And in the G20, even on the financing gap, the conversations and discussions were inextricably intertwined with a subtext, which was to do with the governance of the existing MDBs. The World Bank and IFC and so on in particular. And there were many gorillas in the room with respect to that governance structure that never really got addressed honestly enough in the conversation within the G20 for even the question of financing gap to be appropriately addressed. So a lot of the narrative in the G20 on the financing gap was focused on using the MDBs as a way of creating or aggregating additional resources to be intermediated into infrastructure, particularly amongst the emerging markets and the less developed members of the group. And that conversation was driven, I thought, by a narrative coming out of the MDBs that had them looking at themselves really as balance sheet people. So the preoccupation was always what needs to be done to expand the balance sheet and therefore the staff of the MDBs such that they could provide the necessary funding. Whereas at the high level group, which was a bunch of mostly business people, the thinking was very different and eventually fell on deaf ears. And the argument we were trying to make is that, first of all, the MDBs need to prioritize how they engage with different classes of their client countries. So there are the least developed countries, let's say you have the African countries or the poorer Asian countries. They require a certain kind of intervention. And there are middle income countries, whatever you want to call them, that are predominantly actually the largest customers, clients of the IFC as opposed to the World Bank, and how they need to be dealt with. And the two were never properly segregated. And the argument was, the recommendation that we were making was that the balance sheet of the MDBs should be focused on deployment in support of the poorest countries. But for the middle income countries, they should provide balance sheet support only very selectively, and to the extent of providing essentially credit enhancement if necessary, in order to act as a catalyst to really crowd in private financing from global capital markets, right? And that required a very different way of thinking, because that required creating a new suite of products for the MDBs, which we found that they were, for cultural and governance reasons, just not able to get their heads around. So from the Indian perspective now, what we were arguing, for example, is that instead of the World Bank using valuable IDA resources to fund public infrastructure in our country, wouldn't it be more useful if the World Bank provided, in partnership with the Government of India, some class of capital that provided enough credit enhancement that India could then raise significant amounts of capital from global debt markets. It had to do with the treatment of capital for credit enhancement, Does that need to be guaranteed by the sovereign? Does that form part of the exposure limits of the bank? To all of which there are actually interesting financial solutions, which could have taken care of a lot of these things and given a lot more capacity to the MDBs, but it was never taken up. So one example of how it could have been done, and I'll switch to India specifically, is to, instead of expanding the balance sheet of the World Bank or of the IFC for this purpose, why not encourage the World Bank / IFC to provide seed capital for a giant asset management company, whether it's managing third-party debt funds or third-party equity funds, right, that are then deployed in emerging markets infrastructure. So the balance sheet contribution of the MDBs is only a sliver of the entire fund. The funds then come from people who have liquidity. So the Saudis or the Middle East, the Qataris could actually, and are willing to contribute to some funds. The World Bank, IFC's or MDB's role is then to work in partnership with the potential borrowing countries to create a framework that provides comfort to third-party providers of capital, that the manner in which, or the projects to which this capital is deployed, will be subject to certain rules that enhance people's confidence in the debt servicing capacity of those projects, right? So just to summarize, rather than have the balance sheets of the MDBs grow, have them contribute a sliver of capital to asset management companies that could be managed by them in partnership with the recipient countries. The nice feature of this is that, like in any private equity fund or debt fund, the governance of the funds themselves then becomes independent of the governance of the MDB. So if let's say the Qataris or the Chinese or the Saudis wanted more voice, which they don't have in the institutional structure of the MDB as it's currently constructed, they could have much greater voice in the fund. It would be proportionate to their contribution to that fund. So you really didn't require big political discussions at the international level to change the governance architecture of the existing institutions. This was actually a very convenient sidestep of that thorny political problem, but didn't get any traction. So let me move on now to the Indian experience. Now, in the Indian case, in a nutshell, we have, and I keep arguing this, and a number of you have heard me say this before, we were driven to what in retrospect seems like a model for infrastructure financing and development that could be characterized as prematurely orthodox, or precocious, as some people have called it, which means that we relied very quickly on private participation in the delivery of infrastructure. And we had to do this for very good reasons, to do with the lack of fiscal space. Since the sovereign didn't have enough fiscal space to invest systematically in developing public infrastructure, the idea was to create facilitating frameworks for public-private partnerships to crowd in private investment in the development of greenfield Indian infrastructure assets. And that was the ambitious journey on which we embarked starting the mid-1990s. And the experience of that actually is exactly conforms to the findings of the IMF study, which is that if you try to do this in a context in which the institutional support structures that are required to actually make it work effectively do not exist, you get suboptimal results. So we launched on a very ambitious PPP program. We launched on a very ambitious power sector, power generating capacity development program, by inviting private investment in roads, in power projects, in airports, et cetera, without 2-3 essential complementary institutional structures being fully in place. One is very effective dispute resolution mechanisms. Second is, contracting, bid design, sophistication and capacity in government that is actually bidding these projects out and inviting private participation in. Third is regulatory capacity. So regulatory capacity in India is quite patchy. I would say that regulatory capacity in financial sector has actually been quite good. But when it comes to infrastructure, whether it's tariff fixing or resolution of mandates, solving problems for private bidders, regulatory capacity has been really very, very weak and poor. And there's been capture of that capacity and so on and so forth. So we are now in a situation where a very significant chunk of this private investment, which runs into hundreds of billions of dollars, is in different stages of dispute. And because those disputes are not being resolved in an expeditious enough fashion, and in the absence of a strong enough bankruptcy law and a strong enough regulator that does not want to exercise discretion in solving contractual disputes, in the absence of all of that, it's become a long drawn-out debate about the allocation of pain and the allocation of losses, which by its very nature is a political process. So how much pain should the promoter or the developer of a private or public-private asset take? How much pain should the creditor or the bank take? How much pain should the consumer bear to resolve the problems that we have? Is not a simple matter. I mean, if we had an extremely effective judiciary with the appropriate expertise and no backlog of cases to solve, maybe we could rely on the judiciary to solve this problem, and it would be beyond reproach. But since we don't have that, we are in this awkward situation where bureaucracy doesn't want to step in because they don't, it's a political decision, so it could be misconstrued, and they could be, charged with malfeasance. The politicians don't really want to step in because they want to be seen to be in favor of only the consumer. They don't want to pragmatically solve the problems between the banks and the promoter. And the courts are taking too long. So this is where we are. So what are the lessons from all of this? And so the lesson comes back to really what you were saying, Tom, that we cannot avoid having to revisit and strengthen the mechanisms for public investment in infrastructure. Not to say that we should ignore private participation. I think we must continue to invest effort in improving the institutional support systems that are necessary to crowd in private sector, but that by its nature will take time. In the interim, we should also focus much more on improving mechanisms, improving the efficiency of public investment in infrastructure. And there are a couple of ideas that I wanted to share with the group that are currently in play. So what are we trying to solve for? We are trying to find ways of deploying more public investment in infrastructure given two constraints. One is a budgetary constraint, and the second is a constraint with respect to state capacity. So how do you do that? And so the idea, the sort of hybrid idea that is being floated and in some ways has been adopted by government is really to think of or to create an institutional form that sits in between, that sits outside of government, but is